Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Marina, I'm a portrait and music photographer in Seattle. On this channel, I talk all things analog and document in my film photography adventures. So in today's video, I would like to show how to shoot film with flash and how I do it. Unlike for majority, my photography journey has started from actually using flash before I started shooting with natural light. At first I was using cheap speedlights and then eventually I upgraded to strobes. At that time I only was shooting beauty, makeup and such, so I pretty much was interested only in studio light because that style of photography is very necessary in order to get those sharp, high-end magazine-looking photos. That's how I taught myself how to use strobes right away. And now when I remember this, I was so scared to go out and shoot in the broad daylight. It seemed impossible to control that type of light. I know this is not true. Anyways, that was just a little backstory how I got into photography. Now let's get into how to shoot film with a flash. First things first, you need a flash. It can be speedlight or it can be a strobe. It doesn't really matter. The choice is yours, whatever is available to you and whatever your budget allows. To fire the strobe, we need a trigger that will go on top of the camera. I do have two. This is just old discontinued version. Having two triggers is not necessary. To me personally, it's just a convenience because a lot of times I shoot digital and film alongside because I don't have to remove a trigger from one camera and then put it to another, take some photos and do the same thing. To connect modern flash triggers like these into older film cameras, you would also need these flash sync cables. One end goes to a camera and another end will go to a trigger. That is pretty much how the camera will communicate with a flash or a strobe. There are certain restrictions that you have to consider when shooting film with flash, and different cameras have these different restrictions. Specifically, I am talking about shutter speed. The camera might not work at all shutter speeds. That goes more towards faster shutter speeds. Usually you have to check on your camera what is the flash sync speed. On some cameras, flash sync speed is marked with an X or different color on the shutter wheel, and on some cameras there is no special signage and you have to go through the manual to figure out that number. On my Pentax 645, the flash sync speed is 1/60th of a second. That means if I go past the recommended shutter speed, for example, I would set my shutter speed at 1/250th of a second. Half of my exposure will be covered by the curtain, and this is just a little thing that you have to keep in mind when you shoot film with flash. There are cameras with leaf shutters. That means that the shutter is built into the lens, not the camera. So that rule does not apply to this camera. I can shoot at any shutter speed that I want when I use a flash. When it comes to connecting sync cable into the camera body, you have to make sure you're connecting into the right connection. Otherwise, you might end up with underexposed image. A lot of different 35mm cameras have two identical connections for sync cable. The one that you need to connect to is marked with an X. On a Hasselblad, the connection is on the lens, but there's still a switch with an X and M. If you have Hasselblad and never worked with flash before, make sure you set this to X. That way the exposure will be accurate, otherwise your photo will end up underexposed. I had that happen to me before and I burned several rolls of film. Another necessary piece of equipment that I highly recommend getting is a light meter. I know this is not the cheapest film photography related thing. Long term, it's gonna save you a lot of film rolls. The metering will be more precise and correct, and I really do not recommend using digital camera as a light meter because it's not accurate. My personal opinion, based on my own experience, especially due to the nature of my shoots, they tend to be darker and the light sources that I'm using tend to be more precise. So my metering needs to be more precise. There are already so many videos about how to shoot film with a flash in studio setup, so I would like to do something different, and I'd like to focus on how to use strobe outdoors. When working outside with a strobe, usually I don't use any light modifier because they're not very travel friendly, and in case there is a wind, I don't want to chase my umbrella or softbox or whatever it might be, so that's why I skip them altogether. So every photographer have heard about exposure triangle, but when we work with flash outside, initially we have two light sources that are completely different. One is available light and another one is your flash or strobe, whatever you're using. And the goal here is to match them together. The amount of background light is controlled by the shutter speed. Slower shutter speed will capture more background light, and faster shutter speed will make background darker. But at the same time, we have to keep in mind that slower shutter speed will introduce motion blur to the image, while fast shutter speed will allow to freeze the movement. So how do we match those exposures? First, I meter my available light, and to do it, I would either use built-in camera light meter or I would use this one if there's none in my camera. Let's say I would meter my background and the readings are 1/60th of a second at f4, for example. Now what I need to do is turn on my flash, fire it and see the readings. Let's say my flash said 1/60th of a second at f5.6, which is a little bit overexposed than my background. That means I would need to turn down the power of my light so I can get this reading of 1/60th of a second at f4, and that's how the image will be balanced at the end. My flash won't overpower the scene and the scene won't overpower my subject. That principle is, of course, a just ideal scenario. That is pretty much it. That's how to balance available light with a flash. When you're shooting at slower shutter speeds, for example like 1/30th and below, and you really don't want the motion blur introduced to your image, turn off the modeling light on the strobe if you're using one. That way you will still be able to get that very sharp in focus photo without any motion blur. But if you want motion blur, experiment with that. So that was my process of shooting film with flash. It is quite easy, especially if you have a light meter and know what you're doing. Thanks for watching this video and see you in another one.